Well, viewers, it's that time of year again, the wonderful May Day and officially the 3rd anniversary of this channel. It's been a wonderful ride for me because over the last year I've gone from doing one game at a time to two in an effort to break up these long series that we've been looking through, and I've been dealing with so many boss fights to look at that I've been regularly uploading twice a day for the last 6 months. Unfortunately, that hasn't stopped the Mario series from taking a literal year to get through everything on my list, and that's taking out the multiplayer focused and sports spin-offs that don't really interest me to talk about. And in making this video, it surprised me that at the beginning of the year we were talking about Silent Hill and God of War. Heck, the first game to hit a video after my 2nd anniversary was Gears of War Judgment, which just sounds like ancient goddamn history. To celebrate once again, we're going to be taking a look at my most and least favorite reviews of this year. 5 of each to put it all in perspective and enjoy the time spent. This is a birthday present for you and for me, so let's sit down with our favorite snacks and see which of the 50 candidates made the list. Ready or not, here they come. Oh, this choice for 5th on the best of the year list might be an odd one because in the realm of the industry, critics, and fans, no one seems to talk about this game. Hell, I even know that some people were throwing around the idea that I've hardline bombed. Then it might have given EA an excuse to off Visceral into its mass grave of developers. And coming from the veritable series of EA trying to dress up like Call of Duty and scream boo at people, it really is the black sheep of the family. The reason is obvious. It's because it actually tried to be unique. In the past, we got games like Battlefield Bad Company 2 that took the quirky gang of rejects and losers from the first game and reskinned them into the elite badasses for no other reason than Modern Warfare existed. It certainly didn't make sense in the plot, and EA was nothing if not a trend follower. Then we got Battlefield 3, which was so shameless in exploiting the E3 buzzword of cinematique and the coattails of Call of Duty Black Ops that players were treated to a terrible first-person shooter acting like a movie that sounded like someone tore out half the script at random to the point that the game ends on the developer throwing 2 ideas into the air and rather than trying to catch them, they just farted in the audience's face. And then there's Battlefield 4, which I barely even want to dignify. It was the game that was made during the period that EA believed multiplayer was the only thing that mattered in any video game, and yet its multiplayer shootfest was released in an ET Atari 2600 grade disaster state. Suffice it to say that Battlefield as a series had not been doing well for several years. In order to try and turn things around, ideas were shifted, Visceral was brought on board, and we got this odd spark in the pan, Battlefield Hardline. A story that went with a cops and robbers plot rather than the typical super soldier Black Ops staples and became good. With Visceral heading to writing, Hardline had some of the most solid characters I've seen this entire year. They have interpersonal ups and downs, people get suspicious and have subtle quirks, and characteristics that make them seem human instead of the uber power fantasy that has become the ironically boring standard of which Hardline distances from. One of the big reasons the game works so well is because it successfully adapted something that players have almost never seen into the mainstream video game space. Typical cop show dramas. Yeah, if Battlefield Hardline was aired on CBS, NBC, or any network, then it would have fallen into the trap of generalization, as it looks like the same as 16 other shows that they've aired unchanged. But since it's a video game, it becomes a breath of fresh air. Probably because the game takes some time and doesn't have a single focus like a magic doomsday weapon or an illogically powerful terrorist. The game starts with the players investigating drug activity in what I assume is a modern-esque depiction of Miami. It probably has more of an excuse to use shitty rundown neighborhoods than Gears of War at least, and after some lovely illogical betrayal halfway through, the game then becomes a revenge plot following the betrayer's plan to create a privatized police force who would be more efficient in crime fighting, although I'm kinda sure that most of the audience can realize what a terrible idea that would actually be, since we can't even get privatized prison services correct 100% of the time. And while the story is the backbone of this game, the story's partnered gameplay is the reason you'll actually be sticking with it, because in the strangest twist of the year, Battlefield Hardline decided to become a stealth game. No, I'm completely serious. It's not a shooter with stealth sections or a game with once-in-a-lifetime backstab moves. It's a straight shooting, up front, in-your-face stealth shooter, and it works beautifully since the game hands you some stealth tools, some additional challenges, and big enough maps to give you some strategies to work around, and, most importantly, you don't immediately get ass raped for one soldier noticing half of your shin. I'm pretty sure a famous Snake can be credited for inspiration on this one. At the very least, it's really weird to see a game carrying the Battlefield title in which the greatest rewards are found in not gunning down everything in sight. If we got more games like this, it would make the end of the year sequel fest a happier place to be in. Welp, you can blame me for this one. I forgot one little thing at the beginning of this video. Since we were doing the Mario series for most of this entire year, we will be seeing ties on this list. Yeah, I didn't want to just stuff the list with my most and least favorite Mario games, and our first pair is the Disaster Twins. Mario is Missing, and Mario's Time Machine. Yeah, these two. Just saying their names again is giving me another wave of disappointing nausea. During this retro series, one of the things I got to experience was the Nintendo experiment of educational game development. A completely misguided, in hindsight, attempt that Nintendo had to try and increase their video game fan base by making games for younger audiences. That's my reasoning anyway for why Nintendo threw their coveted Mario license at literally anyone with a half-baked idea back in the mid-90s, and unfortunately for us, one of the companies that sought this backing was Software Toolworks, a well-meaning but utterly incompetent set of folks who are behind both of these forgotten titles. If you're wondering why it's taking me a bit to get to the meat and potatoes of this tied pair of games, then you're asking the right question. There's almost nothing to talk about. These games are so stupid and so thin that they'd be competition for substandard Flash games. What is the premise for both games? Bowser starts monkeying with time to steal treasures and show off that he has the power with plot devices that he just found in his closet or somewhere else contrived. The games are dead on arrival regardless, but the actual quote-unquote education you get with either will turn off even the most ardent video game completionists, which is weird because these games are easy points. You can finish either in under 3 hours because the gameplay mostly consists of walking around tedious flat locations based on real places populated by the most idiotic NPCs even beyond the Bethesda or GTA models of bizarre obliviousness. In Mario is Missing, one of the 5 common NPCs is a police officer who, rather than going to solve the crimes of stolen treasures of humanity herself, decides to just leave it up to the TARDIS hopping plumber in a stupid hat. In either game, you spend most of it running around town picking up ancient artifacts and giving them to random people in order to somehow fix the time stream. And speaking of stupid bullshit that makes no sense, in Mario's Time Machine, this happens. Do you know what the point of that was? No. Do you want to know? Well, fuck you then, because we're Software Toolworks, who somehow had the negotiating superstardom to not only get both of these games official Nintendo backing, but they also somehow got away with 4 ports of each title. I could not even fathom a reason for why Nintendo was that blind to the schlock that was carrying their brand. I can't imagine Nintendo was that desperate for new audience members that they needed both titles to be on the NES, the SNES, and the PCs of that time. It's a good thing that these games were lost to time. They are both lazy and fail at what they set out to do, educate. They can't teach people much since the learning is limited to multiple choice tests and one-page pamphlets of facts, and that doesn't engage a player to do anything more than race for the credits. Since both titles had official Nintendo backing, half of their assets are simply ripped from Super Mario World. Music, sprites, and even the world map of Mario is missing. I know that everything has their fans, but I can't imagine that even the Nintendo fanboys would manage a defense of these two. The most recent series done this year alongside Mario was Dead Space, a line of games that tried to do the Aliens Event Horizon cosmic horror thing in the PS3 era. The roots of Silent Hill and Resident Evil can be clearly seen as a lot of games attempt to use those tropes to scare the player with limited resources and mobs of enemies in a sadistic environment. With the series' first game, Dead Space, it was unexplored territory for Electronic Arts, which is why it's credited under EA Redwood Shores before Visceral Games officially existed as a company under the umbrella, and it worked beautifully. The setting was interesting, the atmosphere was thick as Silent Hill fog, and the plot was something enthralling and terrifying, as Isaac Clarke was fighting against organizations far beyond his power against what could be charitably called space zombies. But the game had its problems, which is why number 4 on this list is held by Dead Space 2. Given a couple years and a bit more breathing room, Visceral Games was ready to take to the stage after a bit of a rocky start. The issues with the original Dead Space were as clear-cut as a zombie's limb. First, having Isaac Clarke be a silent protagonist was an awful idea, as his reactions to the stuff happening around him were crucial for the players to connect to the situation. And second, the prequel game Extraction ended up spoiling the original game's plot all at once if you were playing it canonically. So it lost a lot of its punch, and finally the USG Ishimura wasn't an interesting location to actually play in, as the same stock corridors actually made it easy to become turned around and lost, especially in the darker areas, as the game moved forward. Dead Space 2 fixed almost everything and is currently the pinnacle of the series. Isaac Clarke is involved in the story as his delusions are worsening and the friendly survivors are trying their best to survive the downward spiral. The action is much more in your face and terrifying. The enemies and threats can be more unpredictable on Titan Station since there isn't an obligation by the game to spend an entire chapter stuck in one place, and the story is rock solid, focusing on Isaac's delusions themselves rather than a bigger conspiracy, and his arc is something to make him a stony staple for years to come. It's hard to tell how great the sequel is without spoiling the entire plot, and especially since Dead Space as a series has really wandering narratives that just kind of happen with no rhyme or reason. This is something that Silent Hill could get away with because reality was collapsing around its main characters, but this is taking place in the quote-unquote realistic fictional world of deep space, with the reality bending things coming from the markers and the existence of aliens, so while not everything is perfectly on point, it is a cathartic sight to see Visceral taking so many criticisms on board development and running with them to create this instant PS3 classic. If you have any appreciation for games set in space or horror in general, then I would heartily recommend it in a heartbeat. That is, if you aren't against the idea of the game showing it to you while it's still beating. Now that the list is finally getting underway, we can get to the Silent Hill portion that everyone was expecting. But which of our X-Quadrilogy Silent Hill games made the cut? Would it be Downpour or Book of Memories? Well, the answer may surprise you in how horrible it actually is. Yep, Silent Hill's Shattered Memories, and like another candidate later on in this list, I'm actually amazed at how many people defend it. Some people don't think it's bad, and obviously I disagree, namely that it's a game carrying the title of a series known for its brilliant puzzles being reduced to point-and-click bullshit just because it was on the Wii, and in spite of the things we are going to talk about, this game was apparently successful enough to be ported to the PSP. Which I know isn't saying a ton, but it still costs money to manufacture those bizarre tiny CDs. These things aren't puzzles, Konami, they're complete wastes of time. Something that people who make Escape the Room games would call a puzzle. And the bottom of the barrel doesn't end there, since the game also trades in having an involving and nightmarish other hill, where the player would escape monsters and run to the next location in favor of an incredibly irritating running mini-game where the entire location ends up frozen in shiny blue, rather than the other hill's rusted bloody guts. And it wouldn't have been such a choppy mess of a game if it didn't keep cutting away from the action to get back to the game's framing device. Some sort of off-the-network therapist talking to the player about a bunch of crap that doesn't matter to goddamn anything. No, I am dead serious. these therapy breaks from the actual game I paid money to play don't do anything. And it's the major complaint that everyone had about this game, since the big selling point was that the game psychologically profiled you to relate the terror to things that you were personally afraid of. Except that it's about as effective as being scared by a fortune cookie writer wearing a Scream costume. The game's ideas of psychological profiles are to ask you about your school, your home, and sex life for 5 minutes and maybe change one thing in the game to quote-unquote terrify you. And it can be something as innocuous as a classroom change or the color of a door, so excuse me for not peeing my pants at every opportunity, and all of those problems by themselves would have kept it out of the bottom 5 if it weren't for the part I feel personally insulted by. This game bills itself as a remake of the original Silent Hill, a game for which a remake would be perfectly apt since it has some difficulty curve issues that could be ironed out, and an HDifying would be perfect for one of the early 3D pioneers. But instead of doing that, the developer of this baffling mess threw out all the survival elements, puzzles, and concept of the game in order to build a motion control disaster project to appease the Nintendo monster. But what I take as the worst part of this game, and what put it on my worst reviews list of this year, is the rewriting of the characters, particularly Harry Mason. And we are going to be spoiling the plot of the game, so move to the next number if you plan on playing this to prove me wrong. Harry Mason, in the end, is revealed to be the hallucination of the actual main character of the game, Heather Mason, who is about 12 to 14 years older than her original character, having troubles in life. And some people I've talked to have called me out for my hate of Harry Mason's character in my playthrough, since the personality can apparently change based on different play styles. But considering this was a blind playthrough, it can be assumed that my result is a common one. Harry Mason being rewritten into a total alcoholic womanizing dickhead deadbeat dad is frankly infuriating on how disrespectful it is to a game that this game is remaking, especially since care for the family is what drove the original Harry Mason through all of the other Hill's bullshit and murder attempts. So excuse me if I find this game slandering of his character to be a giant middle finger to not only myself, but also to the video game of which this Shattered Memories owes its maligned existence to. It's worse than Book of Memories Downpour, and maybe even the Light Gun arcade game, because Shattered Memories crossed a line that you don't fucking go near, taking a classic game and throwing it under the bus for some cheap knockoff cash. Can you believe that this is only number 4? Let's see if I can frickin' cheer up with the next number on our list. Ah yes, this game. The story around me getting this one is a bit odd, since it was a complete afterthought. The idea was that I had backlogged 4 of my podcast-style videos, but my Shooter Season 2016 list had only 3 games in it. So I just picked this one up to throw on the pile as a filler game for my schedule. Who'd believe that the game Titanfall 2 as an offhand choice would have hit my number 3 review of the year? Like Battlefield Hardline, I love and remember this game because it did something interesting. If this were, say, N-Space or some other shithead developer, they probably would have had the mech combat show up 5 times to basically be replacements for QTE sections, but in Respawn's mind, the mech combat is not only an integral gameplay mechanic, but they also tie it into the story as well, since the military standing behind the protagonist views their relationships with these mechs as real, important, and one of the highest honors of the military. Also, the fact that half of the game is spent with the pilot and BT conducting a lonely survival mission to get back to base gets us involved with their developing bond and introduces us to mech-on-mech combat, which is incredibly intuitive for a first-person shooter. The Titan sections play out exactly like the on-foot combat, except on a bigger scale with more features. The different Titan classes are gained throughout the game and allow different playstyles to brew as the player learns about their special abilities throughout the frequent frequent combat. Plus, the addition of verticality and platforming to the typical shooter mechanics does add a lot, since the game ties it into the level design at large, rather than when Call of Duty does it and it only justifies giant pits that appear maybe 3 times in the whole game. Then it's back to cover shooting for the rest of the 97% of the playtime. Sure, once the players get back to base, then things get a bit more humdrum as the audience learns that the evil mercenary group is gathering a weapon of mass destruction and some anti-pilot faction is planning to use it against the player's home planet, and I always get disappointed when the plot ends up with person getting WMD, because that's what always frickin' happens. To the point that Battlefield Bad Company 2, the poster child for EA's trend of pandering to the Call of Duty crowd, ended up in the exact same way, except it cut out the heart and interesting traits of the characters that made the original such a wacky take on modern warfare games. Thankfully, creators with more of an audience have held up that Titanfall 2 is a good game, and hopefully EA will give Respawn the creative control needed for them to hopefully make a good follow-up to this brilliant flash in the pan in the usual humdrum waters of the shooter season. I think it's good, and if you don't have it, then what are you waiting for? The pilots aren't going to sit around and wait forever, you know? I know that some may think that it's a bit unfair for a game that I just covered last week to appear on this half of the list, but it must be said that Nintendo's beginning trend of the new Mario series was largely the worst thing that could have happened to the franchise. And that's why the first gets in at number 3, New Super Mario Bros., the biggest video game lie of this year. Back in 2006, it had been nearly 15 years since Nintendo had put a game into the Super Mario Bros. Series since the SNES smash hit Super Mario World, and there was certainly hype enough for this game when it came out. A lot of people were looking forward to it since this game somehow managed to be one of the top-selling video games of all time, a whole year after the Nintendo DS had been released, and with only 6 months between initial reveal and release. That is certainly an achievement, if nothing else. Even more so when I got back to the game last week and realized it was absolute balls. When one of the biggest positives about the game ends up being that the platforming works as intended in comparison to the old NES games, then you probably fucked up somewhere between A and B. In a plot that could have been hashed out by a 10-year-old, Mario has to deal with yet another Princess Peach kidnapping after he was distracted by a single thundercloud, and Bowser Jr. literally kidnapped Princess Peach and then ran to a nearby castle, and then did that another 15 times each time that Mario got to his gormless face. I'm sure some of you out there can already see the major problem in this game, since Bowser isn't the actual antagonist, and the role is taken over by his moronic, annoying son. This constant carrot and stick game isn't actually fun to play, and Nintendo should really have known that, considering the whole princess is in another castle shtick was so bad that Nintendo themselves made it a joke in the ending of Super Mario Bros. 3. And this would have been somewhat okay if the gameplay had brought something new to the table, which it technically did. According to the front of the box, the Mega Mushroom power-up was supposed to be a huge selling point, but then it's never seen in the game beyond 2 appearances, and that rings true for the Mini Mushroom and the Blue Shell as well. Power-ups so rare that you can't figure out how to use them until they are gone forever. Instead, the game falls back on the usual tiny, mushroom, fire flower mechanic, along with a bunch of level design ideas nicked from Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World that make the game feel like a shitty ROM hack fan game made by a single individual over a year of time, rather than a handheld division staffed by 50 full-time people. Between the total lack of originality, terrible plot and antagonist, and graphics that almost make N-Space look competent by comparison, it still astounds me that anyone found good things to say about it. The game is a joke, delivered on top of a middle finger. It presents itself as a new step forward, brimming with new ideas with full backing by Nintendo, and then only delivering the same shit that was done better back when 16-bit design was still a gleam in the collective gaming eye. But unfortunately, the game's quote-unquote success began this terrible trend of the new Super Mario Bros. Series that we'll be seeing quite a lot of in the coming year of Bosscinerator, and there's no way off this ride, so hang on, everybody. Well, this is a bit of a coinky-dink. After slagging off the worst Mario platformer scene this year, we've come full circle and get to talk about a pair of cases that shows that Nintendo did, at one point, have a shred of creative dignity to itself with a pair of console launch titles. Super Mario World and Super Mario 64 tying for the number 2 spot. I know it's an odd choice to tie a 2D and a 3D platformer together in one spot, but they are kind of similar, so I'm hoping this is close enough. Starting with Super Mario World, this was one of the console's launch titles, and the first step of Nintendo into the greater 16-bit developing world, with a game that just screamed with new intentions and ideas. Mario gets characteristically dropped into a totally new location on Yoshi's Island, and has to figure out what happened to Peach. She's been forced into some personal time with Bowser, obviously, and Mario has to figure out a way to his castle and beat him the fuck up. Unlike the new Super Mario Bros. Lying, this game had a lot of rose in its cheeks. This is where the series introduced the Yoshi as a rideable companion about as disposable as a AAA battery, tons of new enemies and level design ideas, the collectible coins which would become a series staple for better and worse, along with the Koopalings, a set of 7 of Bowser's other kids, each with a unique appearance and quirk, along with some little cutscenes where Mario goes to war against their castles. Everything about this game paved the way forward for Nintendo to show the third party how it's done, since the art direction is completely on point and full of life. It's simply a fun game that pushed the envelopes for this new era of design, and that's kind of why I put it next to Super Mario 64, the other game that did that thing I said. With the jump from 2D to 3D design absolutely destroying the integrity of other game properties, it was a minor miracle to see Super Mario 64 pull it off so well by first giving the player an intuitive platforming control with a whole host of different moves that made scaling its walls and crossing its pits an enjoyable challenge since you could sort of play it your way, and the game was just jam-packed full of quirky and unique ideas between the 120 stars you could find, some hidden and some not, and since the game allowed you to hit the credits at around 70 or 80 of them, it was a true open world game in the time when the concept wasn't even a thought at the design table yet. The game came with plenty of disparate themed worlds to explore that managed to be objectively tiny, yet feel huge because of all the content you could find, and the exploring you were required to do in some of the search-type stars. Again, showing off their innovative side, the art direction and look of Super Mario 64 captured the console's weaknesses and turned them into a once-in-a-lifetime art piece. Since the gameplay is so fun and yeah, all the characters look like building blocks come to life, yet that weakness gives the game something distinct unto itself. It looks exactly like Super Mario 64, and that's why it works. Likewise, this amazing game of all time showed the way forward for some to experiment with 3D design, which helped to progress gaming as a whole, but it is a shame that so many fell down the rabbit hole chasing 64's coattails, which is why this game in particular is somewhat like what South Park's success did for television. The best thing that spawned a lot of copycats, so make of that what you will. What I'm gonna do is a depressing trip back to the worst of the year list. With the other games on this list, they got their place more for the idea that they were subjectively offensive and boring rather than being badly designed. And that train stops for the baffling addition to their series that was Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. I know that the game was the literal first step of Battlefield into the realm of Call of Duty storytime, but my lord, the combat that they attached was the most stupid of ideas to pick from. This was released around the time of the first Call of Duties and Medals of Honor, where the typical first-person health bar-based game was the norm. But then Battlefield 2 comes in brandishing this tactical team shooter type of game and expected it to be the next big thing, only to then immediately fall off the cliff holding the idea and dying on impact. And I don't mean that I just didn't like it, or the system was too convoluted as to not bother learning. It's on the list because at points it's almost impossible to play. The main gimmick of the game is that it's trying to be tactical, and spit out soldiers that have different skills and different guns, and then they're your allies on the way to the objective. And you are allowed to take control of these soldiers at any time, so you're supposed to be strategizing the best way to get the job done. But the problem is that everyone dies so quickly and the AI is so shit that if you want to get around the map by quantum leaping, then by the point that you try to do that, all your allies at that point have already died because they weren't taking cover or shooting all the guys in the face. And you also aren't given any sort of ordering mechanic, so the AI is left up to their own devices about what the hell they are doing, and most of the time default to following your dopey ass around, so you end up with this useless pile of soldiers all milling around in one area while the enemies are flanking your ass and the potshots eat up the soldiers you have. Oh, and that's the other thing. In trying to be a strategy-based game, BF2 Bullshit Simulator gives you a limited number of soldiers that, like the health bars, are incredibly small, and the game doesn't give you good indication if you are running out until it's too late. See, the thing is that this game is trying to be tactics-based, but doesn't give you enough information about the battlefield or your allies for that to be even possible. And then there's the last level in the game, which I may or may not have completely stopped doing because it was that high on bullshit. You're forced to try and stop the mega terrorists from setting off nukes that would reset the world order, and there's 3 of these missile silos that you have to sneak into with about 15 soldiers at your disposal. At that point, you might as well put your gun down and let the terrorist win, because his soldiers are almost indestructible, insanely long range, spawning all the damn time and setting up impenetrable guard patrols around and inside the missile silos, meaning that you have to be bullet Christ to even stand a flippin' chance. Most often you'll end up dying while parachuting into the conflict along with the 4 other soldiers you had to help, eating away at the total. Then you'll die and be forced to start again every flippin' time. And it's not like there's a lot of reason to finish this butchered mess, because the plot's even more token than Battlefield 3's. And I'm not saying that the plot is just boring and stupid, it's also produced like a shitty Steam developer, with the high points looking like a terrible PowerPoint presentation, with the game just handing you some pictures somewhat related to your next mission, and that's it. And the plot is third grader material. There's a terrorist with a military who wants to take on the world's superpowers with nuclear missiles because he thinks they're being unfair to everybody. You work with the Chinese and the American forces to stop him, and even if you manage to beat the game's bullshit, the final cutscene where you stop the terrorist is so terribly produced that it would make a congratulator screen feel like a lifelong aspiration. Like I said, this game is this low on the worst of 2016-17 list because it's a butchered design catastrophe, and I'm not offended by its existence like Shattered Memories, but it's still definitely not worth remembering, and there is a big difference between what I find subjectively and objectively bad. We'll be seeing that at the end, but now it's time for some honorable mentions to break in the number 1 slot. Mario Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, the game that started the second half of the Mario RPGs. It's definitely a weird game, and the good kind of weird that gives the world a strange feel to it instead of it being wall-to-wall nonsense. Great, somewhat simple variation on the Paper Mario style hybrid turn-based RPG system. The game had great characters and funny comedy at points, and a villain who was even beyond the reaches of what's considered evil and into full tilt Kefka grade monstrosities. The Bean Bean Kingdom will have a place in my heart, but unfortunately the third act after Joke's End pretty much tanked the game right at the end by throwing the difficulty into the ceiling, which is why it ended up here. Super Paper Mario! Yeah, I know, just played it, so the placement might seem a bit unfair here. Heck, I was about to put Dead Space 3 here on the list, but then I remembered I celebrated Dead Space 2, so there's no dice on that one. But Super Paper Mario gets a mention. Why? Because if the game kept the original turn-based hybrid combat system, then it probably would have gotten a spot on the top 5. The biggest issue is that Super Paper Mario is a game that's trying to have a long-form, thought-out plot with twists and turns, and then having that occur in a platforming style gameplay simply doesn't work. The story and gameplay end up fighting each other since they have major bosses and enemies who should show off their characters in good set pieces, yet never get the chance because the fights are over too quickly. Otherwise, intelligence writing shines through like a polished lighthouse, and it becomes one of the most human games in the series. Realistic, great villains that draw you into the story on their decisions to do bad things set against a very real and direct catastrophe hinging on two competing prophecies to find world-saving plot devices within which sets a story of star-crossed love and a quest for the hope and the hopeless. A game that can be managed to be E-rated, yet still find a way to sneak in suicides and homicides as clever plot twists definitely earns this RPG some high marks. Super Princess Peach. Man, I really wanted to get this one on the top 5 list as much as Super Paper Mario, but some things just let it slide right off the list. Unfortunately, this game's failure was in its writing. For some reason, the game decides to spend time revealing the side character Perry's backstory in small chunks between chapters, but it doesn't actually go anywhere or do anything. The whole thing resolves itself when Perry quote-unquote decides to stick with Peach, which isn't really a decision. If Perry had decided to leave Peach when she needed him most to go deal with his shit, then there might have been an interesting look into his character and motivations and would have added gravity to the final boss, but instead it's just wasting time. Otherwise, this quirky platformer with Princess Peach as protagonist is definitely the odd duck game of the series, with its core mechanic being Peach's 4 emotional abilities that lets her solve puzzles, and she's able to use Perry as a weapon to beat all the challenges to death with. It also incorporates more unique and brilliant level design ideas necessary for any platformer to stand out, along with some enjoyable locations and great soundtracks. All this being delivered by the supporting developer Toze means that hopefully Nintendo will give them the chance to work alone on other projects, because Super Princess Peach is exactly the type of new idea-driven platformer that we need more of. And last but not least, Super Mario Bros. 3! Part of the Nintendo Super Mario Advance series of old platformer ports for the Game Boy Advance. Super Mario Bros. 3 definitely deserves a mention for being the greatest of the original trilogy, taking the rise of popularity since the years of Super Mario Bros. To incorporate that style of game in a new direction, taking the original lonely platformer concept and creating an amazing multiplayer experience out of the deal in one of the most unique experiences to have in a co-op game, where you have to simultaneously cooperate and compete with your co-op partner to progress to the game's castles and eventually save the princess from Bowser's legitimate army of tanks and planes in an actual hellscape. This game also added a ton of power-ups not yet seen in the series that would later become staples of it in the new Super Mario Bros. Series, such as the Tanuki suit, Giant Boot, Statue Mario, and the Frog suit. Although the game didn't benefit from the same totally new leaps of faith ideas that Super Princess Peach or Super Mario World did, but taking the concept from Super Mario Bros. And improving it with new enemies and slick level design meant that the game is a snacky, short, and enjoyable without beating you over the head with difficulty. If you ever need something dumb to do with friends, then don't forget about this aged beauty from the gaming golden ages. And without further ado, let's get to the top of the heap. Damn, I'm so tie crazy in this list that even my dishonorable mentions have one. Two games so interchangeably awful I couldn't actually tell the differences anymore, Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4. Games that were made in EA's not giving a shit these idiots will buy anything period, where in spite of believing that multiplayer was the only thing that mattered, they spectacularly fucked that up as well. We will never forget the complete disaster that was Battlefield 4's multiplayer launch that promised amazing, always changing, unpredictable new era maps, and challenges that devolved into a bug-riddled mess whenever you simply click the server connection button. A time when a 64-player map could only half work if less than half the players actually joined in. I cannot imagine Battlefield 3 suffered worse, but even so, it's Battlefield 3, so I don't even give a shit trying to defend it in any way. The campaigns of both games are truly awful disasters that only exist to try and copy the success of Call of Duty without even giving two shits of their own to figuring out why the games are about, and seem to have been written using a review of Call of Duty Black Ops as a guide, a very unfavorable one if I might add. Battlefield 3 centers around the usual tired-ass tradition of a terrorist with a WMD plot, with no effort to do anything differently, and thinking that a moderately action-filled intro will justify the first-person shooting and nothing else happening through the game's entire 5-hour run. It's all strung together with a Black Ops-style framing device that has no reason to exist. The dude's being interrogated by two other dickheads about things he did before the game even started, so we don't know the stakes, we don't know the interrogators, and we barely even know our own protagonist, so why should I give a shit when I can't get involved in his story, because it's the same damn story we've heard 50 flippin' times already. Terrorist steals nuclear device. Protagonist chases terrorist. Game ends with the protagonist shooting terrorist in the face. Victory for America. Except this time, DICE didn't even give us that. The game ends with something I can only call a double cop-out ending, where the protagonist secures the WMD and apparently blows up in his face. And then we pan over to this heavily accented dork writing a letter before he's off-screen killed by the police. The game doesn't even tell us who the second guy is, or for why we should give a shit, so fuck him. Battlefield 4 does things pretty much the same, except a tiny bit better. The set pieces are more dramatic, the characters are a bit better, and the plot is more well-rounded with some predictable twists in it. But again, the entire story is so token cliched in one note that I can barely give a crap to remember it. That's the true reason Battlefield 4 fails so hard. Literally everything it does in terms of characters, plot, gameplay, and set pieces are so tired and have been done time after time after time that I can't remember a single damn thing that happened in the game. It is that dull, stupid, and insipid. The only things I remember is that the main antagonist was a Chinese general gone rogue, and that the only way that we know that he was killed is if we believe the character who's already betrayed us twice in the story. It isn't a game just written with cliches on the mind, but was literally cobbled together by randomly hitting Ctrl-C and V over a text document labeled Things Call of Duty has done already. Thankfully, EA has gotten on from this and realized the stupidity of the only multiplayer counts thing with Battlefield Hardline, but that doesn't excuse the fact that not only do these games exist, but that they both got 7th and 8th gen ports. Fuck those guys forever. Super Mario Sunshine. That last entry got a bit long, so I'll try and keep this one short. Super Mario Sunshine. I have no idea why people like this game to the point that it got at least an 8.5 out of 10 from every critical receptor known to the industry. But I also know exactly why people like this game. It's the Mario platformer that came out during the platformer dark ages of the 6th generation, and it did a ton of new and unheard of things with the franchise icon Mario. The problem is that everything it tried didn't work. The physics engine is famously broken, and half the platforming controls from Super Mario 64 are mysteriously gone, leaving Mario with only FLUDD to get around places, with which is a slow, limited, and infuriating replacement. The story was a comedic take on the usual Mario tropes without any of the lightheartedness and cheekiness that makes it actually okay when the Intelligent Systems pokes fun, and mostly it results in bad voice acting. The locations and stars are all flat and lifeless and all end up feeling tiny and insignificant when Super Mario 64's locations felt involving while using only half the space that Sunshine does. And worst of all is that Bowser isn't the antagonist of this game either. It's Bowser Jr. again. Now, why does that not work? Oh, it's because Bowser Jr. is an awful character hiding behind his dad, robot death machines, and disguises to try and win fights, and when he inevitably can't, he just takes his ball and runs all the way home crying. Plus, the idea for Nintendo to take out half the Shine sprites and replace them with blue coins is an annoying and terrible replacement for actual challenges. I am not speaking hyperbole when I say that nothing in Super Mario Sunshine works, and that's why it makes the game bad and not fun. But people find some cute redeeming features in it or like the quirkiness of the entire title, which is why I can see that this game has a fan base. I just can't understand it at all, and I hate this game. Call of Duty: Infinite Warfare. I'm sure that no one is going to send me death threats for including this stinker of Shooter Season 2016. Of the 4 games that I played from that year, most of them were really good. Gears of War 4 was a fun start to a new and familiar Gears of War trilogy, Titanfall 2 was on my top 5 list this year, and Battlefield 1 was pretty great and probably would have been on this list if the game was more than just 5 stories tied together with no rhyme or reason. Infinite Warfare, on the other hand, totally deserves the hate it got pre-launch, because it took the great potentials of the future setting done in Black Ops 3, sat it down, and set it on fire, and instead just did the same typical Modern Warfare trilogy things, but instead set it in space. People were in such a rush to get out of this boring-ass mess that the achievements done for doing the side missions were only won by 7% of players at the time of recording. And without those side missions, the game is a pathetic less than 5-hour run. Why does the game fail? It doesn't use the sci-fi setting for any higher purpose or plot reasons, and only set it in space because Activision said so. The characters are almost universally terrible, one-dimensional cardboard people, except for Ethan, who is actually a better character than BT from Titanfall 2 because he's sarcastic, funny, and charming. If Ethan was the main character, I probably wouldn't be mentioning this game at all. But sadly, the game devolves into the same chase the terrorist plot this series has been doing for over a decade. The new villain is a comedically terrible kill-all-the-things villain who is barely in the game at all, and I don't even think actually dies during it. And the entire game is centered around a Mars mercenary group taking charge because the Earth people haven't been treating them fairly for years, which is why their leader is this insane psychopath beyond the means of reason. The few required story missions do some typical boring shit that I can barely remember, and the ending mission tries to pull a Halo Reach on the player and ends up killing all the characters in one section to try and ramp up the stakes. But the reason why this absolutely doesn't work and adds nothing is because most of the characters die from contrived, moronic, forced bullshit accidents, whereas the characters of Halo Reach died doing things that actually mattered in heroic sacrifices. There is nothing heroic or sacrificial about a character dying because her arm got caught in a missile. Fuck you, Infinity Ward. The game ends with the main character blowing up a space station that apparently cripples the Mars mercenary fleet and saves the Earth to continue pillaging their planet for their personal benefit, leaving the player there to starve and die because the Earth takes all their resources. I find something really satisfying about the main character's death simply because I hated the game so much. Although, I don't reserve my highest of hates for it because the problem with the game is that it's futuristic and sci-fi, which inherently tells of wondrous and philosophical things, but ultimately this game is Battlefield 4 style boring, doing things and having missions that no one can possibly remember because this game has no appeal. And now, the big one. The turd of turds from the year of 2016. What is it gonna be? Forgive me for this viewer, but number 1 is also going to be given to a tie. I just couldn't pick between these two was the absolute best, so I just went for both. They're just as inseparable as Super Mario World and 64. And let's give it up for this year's winners, Paper Mario and Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door. Arguably the best of the Mario RPGs because they were the first. Superstar Saga didn't kick off the Mario and Luigi line until the same year as Thousand Year Door came out for the GameCube, and the original was an N64 New Millennia Golden Boy. These games are the adorable kittywinks of the franchise who constantly take the fun out of their cousins Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Bros. 3 by realizing that the series is formulaic and playing around with that. Paper Mario was getting its feet wet in that regard by sticking to the tired Bowser kidnaps Peach into space dynamic and finally getting the jump on Mario. But instead of just sitting there, Princess Peach gets to go on cute adventures with her friend Twink as they help Mario collect the 7 Star Spirits, a group of ancient beings who guards the Star Rod, which is the item by which all wishes are granted and is stolen by Bowser. And only by their hands will Mario be able to stop Bowser and save the kingdom. All along the road, Mario will be encountering enemies using a Final Fantasy style turn-based combat with a hybrid twist. Action commands that allow the player to execute QTEs to score extra damage, and with this, Intelligent Systems was able to craft this quirky gimmick boss fights that showed off their writing to the core. The chapters are vibrant and interesting with fun characters populating the towns, and each with a unique theme. In one, you get to pretend to be Indiana Jones solving the desert's mysteries, and in another, you get to solve a murder mystery in a podunk northern town. The game keeps you guessing, never knowing what's around the next corner as Mario explores, and is one of my favorite RPGs along with its Did Everything Better sequel, The Thousand Year Door, which took the original concept and did it twice better. It's what I would call the game that Intelligent Systems wanted to make on the N64, but couldn't deal with the disadvantages of the system, which is an odd claim due to how much they want to replicate the old N64 game with the whole island maps routine. Otherwise, it's Paper Mario 2.0, with the plot hinging on an unnamed cataclysm that struck the crime-stricken city of Rogueport, and an artifact called the Thousand Year Door, which is a giant door hiding something supernatural, and the hold is weakening, with the scattered crystal stars being the only thing available to lock it down tight. Princess Peach gets herself in another pickle as she's captured by the X-Nauts, a strange mercenary force whose leader is seeking to open the Thousand Year Door and take the treasure for himself for his nefarious purposes. In order to help out Mario, she engages in the strangest video game relationship I've ever seen with a supercomputer named Tech, who begins to fall in fondest memory with the princess. Yet Peach only wants to help out Mario and kind of leads Tech along to help out her actual boyfriend. Meanwhile, the journey is packed with even more lively characters, allies who have distinct personalities, locations with even more backbone, and distinct challenges, and it's that same never know what's coming next storytelling that makes it a true joy to own and replay over and over. Even the combat system has been improved by incorporating a living audience and random number generator into the gameplay that don't end up overtaking the actual game. It just ends up adding some fun to what can be a frankly tired combat model without smacking the player over the head with bullshit, plus it can swing to be on either combatant's side, so it's more fair than it sounds. If you want something new in the Japanese RPG department and haven't looked at either of these games, then you are sorely missing out. 20 hours of content contained in either game, and it'll keep you in a good mood throughout because Intelligent's writing is top-notch and glurgy remarks aside, we now have to go back down the ladder, into the hole we dug under the barrel, and finish this list with some dishonorable mentions. Again, I want to say sorry folks for being predictable since this game hasn't appeared on this list until now, but the absolute worst of the worst game I reviewed in 2016 was the deplorable A to B catastrophic apocalypse that was Philips Hotel Mario. Even on paper at the time, there was literally no way this game was supposed to turn out good. If you don't know, viewer, and thankfully you don't, this game came out of an aborted attempt of Nintendo in the 90s to try and develop an add-on for the SNES to read CD-ROM game. A new technology that Sega seemed to bite at first, and without Sony's help to develop the idea, they turned to Philips, who ended up agreeing to it. A short-ish time afterwards, Nintendo took input from the reception of the Mega CD device from their competitor and decided to sever ties with Philips and the project. In return for the lack of revenue, Nintendo agreed to give license to Philips of 5 of their available iconic characters. They apparently chose Mario, Luigi, Princess Peach, Link, and Zelda. Perhaps Nintendo gave them a whole other bunch for free, but, I don't know. The game was developed by Fantasy Factory, a Philips first party with little time and only tiny bits of advice from Nintendo beside the limiting funding making the game. On Nintendo's part, they were doing this as an obligation and didn't much care for the final product. Why would they? They weren't making the damn games, and apparently they thought the end product was so distant from theirs that the fanbase wouldn't notice this drop in quality. This was in the age of pre-internet reviews, so maybe this thing sold like 50,000 copies at best? I don't know again. Like I said, this game was a bad idea from start to finish, and it shows in the final product, which I had to jump through some real hoops to even emulate properly, since the go-to CDI emulator had been dropped from its original developers, and the other one got absorbed into MAME, which is kind of an ass to get running. So, Hotel Mario was an attempt by Philips to break into the PlayStation style of FMV game of the time, but instead of using actors or CGI, the underfunded bros at Fantasy Factory resorted to hand-drawing their cutscenes, and trust me, there weren't any Tex Averys on Fantasy Factory's payroll, and so the ending result was a DeviantArt-style mess of people who weren't paid enough to give a shit, and man, the voice acting still sends chills down my spine as I lose chunks of my short-term memory just listening to these damn monsters.
You know what they say, all toasters toast toast.
To be fair to the game, this was released around the time of the decentralization of voice acting, and around the time we also got to see Mega Man 8's take on the whole unprofessional voice actor thing, so it was partly a product of its time. But that doesn't give the actual writing any points, because beyond the cutscenes that just connect these levels together, the only uniqueness to the lines is that Fantasy Factory tried to direct some comedy bits, but only ended up creating baffling pun-based horrors that couldn't even work in pun logic. And what's to say about the actual gameplay that connects all this? It's stupid, misprogrammed, awful, and the idea doesn't even make sense. The Hotel Mario is a puzzle game about all of the Koopalings opening hotels to act as fortresses to keep Princess Peach safe from her saviors. In order to stop the Koopalings' plan, Mario has to shut every door in the hotel. The idea already fails from the outset, since either these hotels are only rented out by the Koopalings' own minions, which is stupid for obvious reasons, or they are severely hemorrhaging money out the ass because literally no person outside of the Koopa Troop could actually stay here. Like, frickin' seriously, why bother calling these places hotels when almost anything would have made more sense? The actual gameplay is even stupider. For something that tried to ape Super Mario's platforming from its past games, you'd think that they'd give you the ability to actually do that. But since most of the platforms of this game are too close to other platforms, not only do you have to calculate the movement of the enemies around you on that floor, you also have to calculate it from the floor above you, since every jump has Mario become vulnerable to the enemies that aren't even around him. That's how retarded this game is. And most of the time the game will be killing you in one hit because the game doesn't tell you that the power-ups are usually found in doors that are already closed. Thanks for making that clear, Fantasy Factory, love you for it. And some levels later on really boggled the mind in how nobody thought that this was a bad idea. I mean, yeah, the developers were really underfunded, but then you should have cut the level out wholesale instead of just letting Wendy's Hotel stand, because that's the point in the game I gave the fuck up. Each level of that hotel has you working your way through 2 screens of doors with some of the most bullshit enemies ever designed in games. Coins flying around everywhere in huge numbers constantly, Goombas following suit, and maybe some Koopas thrown in for shits and giggles? But her boss fight was where it fell apart completely. Since her attacks are constant, they home in on you constantly, and perfectly home in on you, should I mind. They will follow you wherever Mario goes, and you can't kill them without a fire flower, which at this point in the game is almost impossible to have. If any player got past this game by even the halfway point, I would be truly amazed, because this game is so badly programmed that even that is just a true feat. I suppose it's good that the game has no concept of dying otherwise. It might have been a bug on my part, but if you lose all your lives on a level, the game just jams you right back to that level as if it has an infinite amount of continues. But whatever the case, this executed mess developed by people with no money and apparently no talent or good ideas could never have been good, with the way that Nintendo was treating it as a contractual obligation. Hell, this game was so cast aside that Nintendo wouldn't even fess up for a Japanese port of it. This one was never released in Japan, which really just says it all. Heck, I didn't even have much to say about this game, except that I did, because everyone already knew what I was gonna say about it, and that this game was gonna be at the bottom of the barrel because literally nothing could have been worse outside of Steam. Fantasy Factory was Philip's own guys receiving the shit end of the stick on a deal gone sideways at the worst of times. It's kind of a shame, but then again, since Fantasy Factory probably did get the 3 Zelda games too, I'm not giving them any pity on that front. If you made only 1 Zelda game, then maybe it would have been halfway decent instead of the perpetual video game laughingstock. So, to conclude, this year was kind of a mixed bag, and on my part, that's pretty good. You need to balance out the good with the bad reviews in order to keep the interest going. If all games had just been Battlefield 4 style boring, then I'm sure my interest would have waned, and I wouldn't have managed to hit 15-minute reviews by the end of the year. By the way, expect a lot more of those. I'm definitely getting into writing a lot more. Anyway, I want to lastly thank you guys for continuing on this journey on this channel. It's been a heck of a lot of fun, and I enjoy making videos for those who enjoy it. If you'd like to see more, then please support me, and as always, I wish you all a victory for gamers. First review of the year is coming out next, so please stay tuned.